Good evening, good afternoon. I'm Andrew Haslam. I'm going to be the conference moderator for the next 2.5 days. The emergency procedures are if the bells go off and the fire exits are behind us, do pause along the way to grab a drink from the bar. However, in normal circumstances, you don't get a drink until we get through the opening address, so you're mine for the next hour. Except I have about 60 seconds in which I'm going to introduce the Managing Director of INsig2, who are keynote speakers, and he in turn will introduce the actual keynote sponsors, and he will in turn introduce the keynote speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Goran Opanica to come to the stage and open the conference.
Thank you very much. It was perfect pronunciation of my family name. I don't know if you don't know, but in English language there is no sound ts, and I have it in my family name. Anyway, thank you very much for coming here. I'm really happy to be here for the... You know, Fred, last time when I was standing on this stage, you gave me an iPad. I'm still waiting. I'm really happy to be a title sponsor of this conference, not only because of the business reasons. I really believe that this conference is one of the best in Europe about digital forensics, about digital evidences, and about internet security, cybersecurity in general. But also I believe that, you know, Fred is a great guy and he's showing so much passion into organizing this conference, and he's so dedicated to deliver this conference that I really have to support him, because we also share some views about the future of this conference, and most probably in the next couple of months, maybe next year or so, we will see globalization of INsig2 LTEC Europe conference. Maybe we will move to some other parts of the world in order to gather together also lawyers, law enforcement people from those regions all together, because you know that today cybercrime or any other form of the crime does not know the term like a geographical border of the country or jurisdiction of some law system. This is why we also need to start to think a little bit out of the box. Especially I'm addressing to you lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an IT guy. And for us, having no borders in our thinking is somehow inherent to our minds. But you know, lawyers are always thinking about jurisdictions. Which jurisdiction does this crime belong? In cybercrime, there is no jurisdictions, you know. Cyber criminals does not need to be present on one specific spot in order to commit the crime. They do not even need to come to any country to commit a crime. Today, they can sit who knows where, and with one same crime offense, there can be many victims all around the world. And this is something we need to find a way how to address it. You know, we cannot just sit in our offices, sit in our chairs and say, wow, that's not my jurisdiction, I don't care. We definitely need to find a way how to deal with it. And it's not only geography that changes how we are going to tackle criminal acts, it's also organizations. How criminals get together to do their crime. For example, if you read your laws, and if you look in the past of the crime, organized crime looked very simple. You had a capo or a godfather, you had a consigliere, we all looked the movie Godfather and all those things. There was some kind of army they had, and all in all, organized crime had a very stable organization, very defined organization. You know who rules what, you know who is supposed to do what. But today in the cybercrime era, basically everything is in the cloud. Even crime is in the cloud. Have you ever heard about crime as a service business model? It's true. I know it sounds funny, but it's true. Because, you know, today criminals do not have any organization. They just go on Amazon, they buy a few books, they go on iTunes, they buy a few songs, and then they go to some sites to, you know, to download some botnets, to order some password cracking service, or to order malware development. It's true, it's really happening. So they are also having some kind of a project-based organization. They do not know each other. So law enforcement people and prosecutors you will have a hard time to try to find a way to connect people who are not connected anyway, just by the money. This is the only thing that connects them. So, you know, it's pretty huge challenge. One, just to give you an answer on this slide, end of 2012, drug smugglers from South America, they have hired Chinese hackers to break into the information system of transportation company, to break into the information system of the shipping company, the company who owns ship and transfer the goods to the overseas. And also they have broken the computer of Rotterdam Port Authority. So what actually has happened, people who never saw each other, like drug producers in South America, Russian hackers, they have committed perfect crime. Drug smugglers put container somewhere in the warehouse. Some guy came with a truck, put the container on the truck, brought container to the port. Port authority put the container on the ship. Ship went to the Rotterdam. In Rotterdam it was unloaded and spread all over Europe. This is actually happening, you know. So it's not just fun. So let's try to think out of the box. Let's try to find a way how to tackle those modern sorts of the crime, modern things. We cannot only imagine what new technology will bring. Today we have IP watches, we have IP TVs, we have IP fridges, we have IP ovens. Everything is IP today. Some estimate is that currently we have about 23 billion devices connected on the internet at every single moment. What does it mean for the crime? I really don't know. We are going to see what the future will bring to us. So hopefully I managed to bring in new ideas how the crime is committed today, and especially I'm addressing you who are lawyers between us, to try to find a way how we can make this planet safer, a little bit more safer for us and for our kids in the future. I'm sure that INsig2 LTEC Europe will take its part into this process. We will try to bring all those people together who can do something to make this planet a little bit more safer. With the time, who knows in which part of the world Fred will go. You never know. We will see where we will end up, hopefully making this planet safer. And now I would like to invite Mrs. Carol Iniano. Have I pronounced it well? Good. She's a managing director of e-discovery research center of the Bloomberg BNA, and she's a keynote speaker representative tonight for you here. Please, Carol.
Good evening. My name is Carol Ioannou, and I'm the managing editor, actually, of Bloomberg BNA's electronic discovery publications. It's my great privilege to introduce the opening event of the 2014 LawTech Europe Congress, a keynote speech delivered by my good friend and longtime colleague, Jeffrey Ritter. Before I introduce Jeffrey, however, I would like to thank our host, the marvelous Frederick, for inviting Bloomberg BNA to participate in LawTech Europe for the first time. Frederick is not only one of the most organized and hardworking individuals I've encountered, he is also one of the most personally generous and hospitable hosts it's been my good fortune to know. I'm very pleased to have been the recipient of his warm welcome and deep knowledge of a very beautiful city, which he has kindly shared with many of us in the last day and a half. Frankly, it's also nice to be on a program with someone whose name is even more difficult to pronounce than mine is. That's quite the refreshing change. Let me tell you a little bit about my company, Bloomberg BNA. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Bloomberg and widely known as a respected source of legal, tax, regulatory, and business information for professionals. We boast a network of more than 2,500 reporters, correspondents, and leading practitioners who deliver expert analysis, news, practice tools, and guidance. Our coverage spans the full range of legal practice areas, including tax and accounting, labor and employment, intellectual property, banking and securities, employee benefits, healthcare, privacy and data security, human resources, and environment, health, and safety. Beyond that laundry list, however, lies something that is probably more relevant and more exciting to the audience that is convening in the next couple of days, and that's Bloomberg BNA's mission. It is to leverage leading-edge technology and trusted content to deliver essential, innovative solutions to professionals. It is accordingly very appropriate that we are introducing tonight's presentation, the title of which is Building Digital Trust, the new authors of the rules for digital evidence of the truth. Clearly, that's from what I've told you about our mission statement, that's a topic that's very close to BB&A's corporate heart. It's also an ambitious task for an address that's slated to come in under 60 minutes. But if there's one thing that can be said with confidence about Jeffrey Ritter, it's that he's never been one to back down from a challenge. There's simply no issue that has arisen from technology and digital information that is either too complex or too nuanced for Jeffrey to have considered, addressed, and more importantly, search for a way to apply in a fashion that is useful and beneficial not only to members of the legal profession, but to society at large. Jeffrey has something of a visionary about him. I have been reporting on the emergence of American e-discovery for a decade and a half now, and have attended more conferences and seminars and legal education programs on the subject than I can even recall. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room very much like this, listening to a panel who has decided that they're introducing the next best thing, a new innovative idea, describing a new application to assist us in our work, and thought, gee, Jeffrey was talking about that 5 years ago. How did Jeffrey develop the insights on digital information that we will be sharing in part with us this evening? He became fascinated with the topic some years ago when we were still talking about data law, which was actually a title publication he co-founded in the early 90s. He participated in various global initiatives on electronic commerce and privacy, including advising a UN Economic Commission. In the interim, he had a 27-year career as a practicing attorney, including being a member of a prominent Washington, D.C. law firm, where he led technology practice and e-discovery practice groups, in a time when such practice groups were not nearly as common as they are today. Jeffrey really hit his stride, however, in the last 8 years, when he decided to dedicate himself to what has emerged as his true passion, educating others on the topics that he has studied and considered throughout his professional life. He comes to us directly from the University of Oxford Department of Computer Science, where he taught professionals pursuing advanced degrees in the first international course ever developed on building information governance. He will be returning this spring to the Johns Hopkins University Whiting School of Engineering, where he will be offering an online course in privacy engineering, while also teaching at Georgetown University Law Center. I mentioned earlier that Jeffrey never met a challenge he didn't feel he could meet. In the past several weeks, he's proven that this is as true in his personal life as it is in his professional life and his intellectual life. One interest that Jeffrey developed after leaving the practice of law has been competitive cycling, in which he has excelled. Unfortunately, a little over 9 weeks ago, he was involved in an absolutely appalling biking accident. True to form, he was on the phone with me discussing some joint projects we're considering before he was even fully released from his first initial hospitalization. He was also bound and determined that a little thing like a neck that had been broken in 5 places wasn't going to keep him from his Oxford teaching job or delivering his remarks to us this evening. Please join me in welcoming the bruised but amazingly unbowed Jeffrey Ritter.
Again, first of all, thanks to Fred, Gar, and Carol. I need to give you an apology. Normally, at a time like this, as the opening speaker, you're supposed to start with a humorous story or a joke. But instead, it's an apology. Several years ago, in the early morning dawn, before light had even shone into the windows, I was getting dressed to go give a speech. I was asking my wife, still lazily asleep in bed, should I tell the one about the lawyers buried up to their neck in sand? Or how about the one about the brass rat? And she looked at me and surprisingly got out of bed, walked across the room, reached up and cradled my hand gently in her hands, and said, "Darling, you're not going to tell any jokes. You're a corporate lawyer. You're not funny." And so, for this purpose, I have to get right into the substance. Do you remember in April of last year, somebody hacked into the AP Twitter account and tweeted out, the White House had been bombed, the president had been injured. Within 90 seconds, $126 billion in trading losses occurred. Did you know that the second and third people indicted after Bernie Madoff, who engineered the biggest fraud scheme in U.S. investment history, if not the world, were his software developers who had written programs so intelligent that they had created trading data that deceived the best examiners of the SEC and the best auditors of the largest investment funds in the country. Do you remember that uncomfortable feeling that you or your parents or your grandparents had when they were told the bank would no longer give them paper statements? Each of these are moments in which digital trust is coming under question. And so today, as we gather here in this wonderful conference on Eastern Europe, we're not only meeting to talk about forensic evidence and information, but we're really beginning to wrap our arms around the biggest question of our time. How will we as a global race trust the information the net is creating? How do we build the rules? This afternoon, I want to do three things. First, I'm going to share with you, and as Carol said, the 8 years I've been working at this, what I believe are the 4 key insights into trust that help us envision where we are going as technologists, as lawyers, as citizens of the world. Then a strategy that not only is important, but I can tell you why it's going to work and why it's inevitable. And finally, as a keynote speaker should do, a challenge. As you begin this conference, how to view all of the content, the speakers, the technologies, that hopefully remind you of this moment of conversation before drinks. So, let's get started. When people in Oxford were asking me what I taught my students, I asked them if they remembered the maps of ancient mariners, where the sailors, when they were afraid to go somewhere, would write, "Here there be dragons." And I said, that's where I take my students. Beyond the horizon, where cyberspace collides with the rule of law. And at that moment, they'd say, "Oh, that's interesting." And they'd walk away. But for me, the story begins more simply. In my early 20s, I did the one thing you shouldn't do as a young lawyer who was told to go do some records discovery. I picked up too many heavy boxes. And I injured myself. So I had to go to the hospital for a little abdominal surgery to stitch me back together. The doctor walked in. I was young. I didn't know the doctor. It had been one of those youth plans. I was already drugged up for surgery, laying there. He came in with his manila folder in hand and said, "So, we're taking out your appendix today." I jumped up and said, "No," and realized I was the victim of mismanagement of information. He had grabbed the wrong manila folder. Indeed, though, whether it's that simple incident that started my passion, I'm not sure. But today, the SEC, last week, the SEC announced record fines and enforcement actions because they're using big data analytics to expose illegal conduct. On the other side of the equation, though, the FBI director said yesterday or Friday that he wants to be able to have the backdoor keys to encryption on our mobile phones. These are becoming the issues of our time. What questions do we need to ask about digital trust? I discovered, though, it's not digital trust that I need to be thinking about, but trust itself. So, as I offered, there's 4 cornerstones that I'd like to present to you. Let's begin. The first cornerstone may surprise you, but it's a notion that I think is imperative as our beginning stop. We think of trusting people, trusting organizations, trusting our church, trusting the book, trusting the conference. We think of it as an emotion, but it's not. The trust is not an emotion. Trust is a decision. It's a decision we do every day, whether it's as simple as picking up a newspaper, trusting the safety of the lock on our hotel door, or anything else in which we reach out for a tool to do work. It's a calculation. Does this tool, this thing, this person serve the purpose that we need to accomplish the task ahead of us? It's a calculation. And as we look at how people make trust decisions, it's remarkably rigorous and consistent. We look at the rules and we try to decide if the tool actually meets our requirements. I think of it as easy as a soup spoon. Let's say I'm sitting at dinner this evening and somebody's just been hacking and coughing into their hand and they're telling me they've had flu for 3 days. And they says, would you like a taste of my soup? Wow, think of all the rules that you're suddenly going to use at that moment in time. Do I use his spoon or my spoon? How much of that soup has he had? Did his germs get coughed onto that soup? Do I care about whether I get sick moments before I give my own speech? These kind of questions are simple, and yet when we begin to look at the process, they get more and more complex. Driving through Prague, you get the car, you look into the glove compartment to find your way, and the map is dated 1967. Do you trust that map to get you from here to there? Or you go online looking for digital information. It's the same process. We're applying rules to make a decision. Trust is not an emotion. Now, if we're going to be making decisions that require rules, we've realized that it's not that easy. It's almost mathematical, in fact, as we add up whether all the features or the liabilities that we're looking for match up. And so it brings me to the second concept, that to calculate trust accurately, we need those rules. That's the second cornerstone. The trust decisions are rules-based. Now, those of us that design technology, those of us that are lawyers, are supposedly some of the best representatives in society of what rules are and where they come from and how to write them. And when we're choosing a soup spoon or a map or a single email that came from, well, it looks like an odd address, well, at that particular moment, that's easy. But when we have to begin making trust decisions that involve choice between multiple alternatives, it gets complex. Just imagine going to get a hammer. In America, one of the big box retailers is called Home Depot. They have 162 hammers listed on their website. What weight do you need? Do you want a wood handle? Do you want it forged steel? Is it going to be proper for using for shaping metal? Is the hammer used? Has it been sealed in a container? Does it have the rubber handle that allows me to work in the rain? All these are rules in which what we're doing is gathering information to process our rules. It happens very fast. It's very complex. But if we begin to slow it down from what normally is a Malcolm Gladwell kind of blink moment and look at it almost as a decision process that we can slow down to 28 frames per millisecond, we begin to see the way we collect information, bring our rules in, and decide, does it add up to be the evidence that we need? Is it the facts we're going to rely upon? And that's what we're witnessing now. As this century begins to gain its momentum halfway through the second decade, we're discovering that making trust decisions about digital information is becoming hard when the witness that's testifying is the computer itself. And I love this picture that I came across several years ago. There's no person in the witness chair. It almost looks like the computer's giving the testimony. And yet, that's exactly what we're asking the administration of law to accomplish. Whether it's paper or electronic, whether it's oral testimony or digital information, the rules-based process of evaluating is it the truth remains the same. And so if we're going to move forward in the 21st century and keep a system of law that works for Western economies, to build better and better systems of law across developing economies, to have a rule of law in a future world where there are no more emerging economies, these are the issues that I think we have to confront. Does all the evidence add up? Those of us that think of email and other documents as just a record know that it's not that anymore. It's the metadata. It's the information inside the computers. But that information essentially is becoming superior to any oral testimony that may be provided about what did or did not happen. Look at these screenshots, for example, from a simple records management program from the 20th century, recording all the activity that actually occurs with a file. We began to collect information about the memorandum. We began to collect features about the properties and the logs and the activities. We began to create records of the many different kinds of things that can carry that record until we have, ultimately, second-by-second analysis. Who needs an oral witness? The computer is speaking the truth. And yet, the calculations are getting harder when the information we need to process our rules is about the information, and we're looking to the computer to be the witness. It gets tricky. A few weeks ago, in fact, Gordon just mentioned it, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted a Chinese citizen living in Canada accused of trying to hack into the US-based Boeing aircraft's computers to get the design plans to sell to Chinese companies. How else do you believe the Department of Justice will prosecute that case except with digital information? It's the entire case. It's the only evidence of the truth in which we can enforce the rule of law. And so what we realize is that it's something else is happening. It's not just the information, but it's the third concept. That to trust digital information, you must also first trust its source. Where did it come from? How was it created? How was it stored? Who had access? Was it been altered? Was it complete? Is it the truth? Is it what we rely upon as the history on which we will apply our rules? You know, it used to be easy. You put your hand on a book of faith, you raised it and said, I'm going to tell the truth. But you remember the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, how the computer was always on, always watching, never stopping. Very hard to tell the credibility of a red computer eye. And so the challenge we have when we begin asking about the computer sources is where are they, in fact? This is a heat map of the internet 3 years ago. And of course, it looks even more intense today. The information we're asking you to rely upon literally could come with cloud-based services from anywhere in the world, from any device, from any system, from any app, from any operator, from any user. How do we make the decisions to trust? It's information. It's information about information. It's information about the source. It's almost as if we're Indiana Jones standing on the ledge of the last scene there, the last crusade. His father's journal is in hand. Do I step forward and trust the journal? Or do I step back? He had swords swinging at his head. His father had been shot. The decision of his father's life held in his hands, and yet he had to decide, do I trust the information before I fall into the bottomless pit? And of course we know he didn't. But for any of us that are lawyers or technicians that are being asked to assemble the evidence of the truth, sometimes it seems like it's the same ledge. How do we calculate with confidence that the information we're relying upon is reliable, is trusted? Imagine if Indiana Jones had been standing there instead of with his father's handwritten journal with an iPad. It would have been an entirely different storyline. And so, as we move forward, we realize that there's three principles that we've brought together to describe trust. It's a rules-based calculation fueled by information acquired from trusted sources. Wow. That's not law. That's not technology. That's something those psychologists do, or the behavioral scientists, or economists. We don't have to worry about that stuff. And yet it is, because we cannot do the jobs that we're asked to do unless we can overcome an explanation of how to achieve that. Some people call it information governance, or IG. What's involved in governance, though, is building and executing the rules. Okay. But it seems to be working pretty well. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now globally. Is there anything broken that needs to be fixed? There is. And we'll start with the dilemma of Dead Man's Curve. In the 1960s, one of the popular pop songs was Dead Man's Curve. And the girl's voice would say on the background as the music was playing, say, look out, look out, look out! And you hear this crash. And they died. There really is a dead man's curve. This is the old trail ridge in California. And when it was originally built, it was perfectly fine infrastructure for carrying the little Model Ts around the bend. But then the cars got faster, the kids got braver, and they rolled off the edge and died. So they put stones along the edges of the road so the wheels would hit the stones and they'd slow down. But they kept going faster, and they rolled over, and they died. And they put wooden barriers, they crashed through them and they died. They put steel barriers, they died. They kept patching the infrastructure, you might say, trying to put new rules in place to slow us down. And ultimately, we abandoned it and said it simply doesn't work anymore. Well, I would submit to you that the rule of law from the 20th century that relies upon oral witnesses to prove the truth and relies upon institutional systems that are designed to provide alternative versions of the truth simply are no longer suitable for a global world. We have to get off dead man's curve and figure out how to build new rules. Even that infrastructure is broken. By the way, this is my neighborhood outside Washington, D.C. on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning for 2 to 3 hours. We simply can no longer achieve the velocities and mobility that we need to live comfortably. Our rulemaking is the same way. We are so slow and ponderous that law is separating from technology. Something's happening in the technology space that's changing. There's two other things, though, that are kind of condemning the status quo. Remember the Hollywood films when the sheriff would get the posse together and they'd start chasing after the bad guy and be riding their horses, and the bad guy would get across the stream and the sheriff would stop. Because on the other side of the stream, he had no enforcement powers. It's the same way problems we face now, as Byron was saying, with cybercrime. We no longer can enforce our rules through the traditional structure. Something else is needed. And yet, despite all that, we know there's one other problem. That the costs of finding information are skyrocketing. The costs of validating information, proving that it can be trusted, are even higher. So if dead man's curve is continuing to cause us to roll off the edge and die, if the infrastructure is broken, if the posses can't enforce it, and the costs are going up, we need to find out what's broken and fix it. When we look at what electronic discovery is doing, it's teaching us what's so broken inside companies. There's not proactive records management. There's not management of the information as evidence. We're still trying to figure that out. What I'd love to do is put a corporate officer on the stand under oath, hand on Bob Cafe, who says to me, oh yes, I've had 32 requests for adequate funding to support records management rejected by senior management or cut by 50% because they were never able to make the business case for why that was happening. And that's the last obstacle. You know, no matter what we want to say is the right thing to do, compliance, whether it's because the law requires it. Ultimately, in the C-level suite of board of directors, whether it's a 5-person company or a 5,000-person company, show me the money. The question we have to confront is, will information governance create wealth or at least preserve the wealth of our company better than the status quo? The choice comes to this. Do we build information governance or do we abandon hope? Obviously, there is a strategy to build it, and that's what I'd like now to share. What is the strategy that works? We commit to rules-based design. Think about it. Would an architect build a house and leave out the staircase only to come back and try to figure out where to put the stairs? Ever done a renovation project like that? It's hard, right? And yet today, as we try to put in place in corporate infrastructures the rules for finding and managing digital information that we need in business, it's like it's a stone castle that we're trying to have to cut through the ceilings to try to put in place what we need to do our job. And so in committing to rules-based design, I suggest we do it at every level. Systems, devices, information, Internet of Things. Not only do the rules need to be placed, but we have to be able to enforce them. And we cannot any longer rely on the nation state to protect the boundaries of our companies and the safety of our information. Instead, business rules, technology rules, and legal rules need to be integrated together so that indeed we can build functional governance of this new asset of the 21st century. How to do it? Well, reading Shakespeare is always a good idea. There's nothing more fun than walking the streets of Oxford last week, knowing I'd be here with you today. You know, they were preaching revolution, those two drunks in Henry VI. They weren't necessarily really serious about killing lawyers, but they understood, as do I, that finding all the rules we need to effectively build information governance is hard, and maybe the lawyers aren't always the best resource with which to do so. You know, finding those rules is hard. There is no single book or source of knowledge we can turn to that pulls all of the rules together. But as I mentioned, it's the same problem that architects have. When architects are building homes today, you think about it, they need electrical rules, they have plumbing codes, they have load limits, like this platform I'm on, they have floodplain zones, they have heating, cooling restrictions. There's no unified book of rules, so the architect has to pull them off different shelves and figure it out. That costs money, mistakes are made, revisions are done, until finally they have blueprints that work. They have a building that hopefully is safe, sound, and does the job of providing housing, office space. When we're building our information systems, the same concept is involved. You know, wonderful paper, it was in 1987 by John Zockman, actually said that information architects need to work like real architects and use blueprints to show everyone how we're building the systems. When the systems become more complex, though, it's difficult to find all the rules. How do we do it? How do we continue to rely upon the systems of law? Look at what's happened in the United States, 10, 12 years since the federal rules were revised for the first time in 2006. Thousands of decisions, and we still have new rules coming out, possibly next year, and they use the word reasonable, appropriate, satisfactory, words that have no precise meaning, words that leave every single IT developer pulling their hair out and screaming, what am I supposed to do to comply? In Australia, in their law schools, they're teaching how to write legal rules so that they can enable the automated execution of compliance. It's kind of interesting. How is it that they're doing so? Instead of relying on legal rules and imprecise semantics, instead they're turning to standards. Technology rules that literally within the technology of the net have the same weight as law itself. I can't send an email from my machine to Carol's until there's a sophisticated negotiation between dozens of machines as to the precise execution of those packets with the rules by which they transit. If a single packet fails to satisfy the rules, the entire message can be rejected and resent, or not received at all. Something's happening where the technology community is beginning to write the rules to enable business, to enable us to trust information, and they're not waiting for the lawyers. The best example comes from Britain, where 4 years ago, the British Standards Institute tackled this problem. How will we trust digital information as evidence? And they formulated a new standard, known as BSI 10008, on the admissibility and weight of electronic evidence in legal proceedings. A comprehensive scale of rules to apply to information as evidence. To the best of my knowledge, from my friends and sources, not a single lawyer was involved in the drafting of that standard. They're changing the game. And they have to, because the precision that's required by standards, this consistency with which they can be implemented globally, is what business requires to retain momentum and speed. There's an evolution that's occurring. It's one that, frankly, is stunning at the pace at which we're all living through. Hey, let me put this in perspective. As Carol mentioned, I've been at this for a while. My first legal question about technology was in 1982, when my client, a retailer having garments manufactured in China, had a problem. The Chinese manufacturers would not accept a fax of a signed purchase order as a binding contract. It literally was at that stage in terms of technology and the collision with the law. That's where the dragons were 32 years ago. But today, what's happening is a transformation in the way the rules are based. When we look at the rules-based orientation and the legal rule structures that we're familiar with, there's almost a hierarchy, a parent-child relationship from constitution to statutes to regulations to court decisions in numerous volumes, and then into business rules and contracts, ultimately carving them down to precision, even to the data layer. What's happening, though, is an evolution. First of all, formal law, as the set of rules that govern a business, is compressing. We think there's a lot there, but in comparison to the other sources of requirements to which businesses have to align their systems, their people, their business practices, and their information, the law is a small part of the problem. There's actually fewer and fewer rules in the legal. Nation states can't keep up. Courts can't keep up. They're simply not able to author all the rules that business needs to trust its own information. So what we're seeing is an explosion in standards, voluntary, consensus-oriented, participatory democracy occurring outside the nation-state organization to write the rules to do business, to write the rules to trust information. There's no better example of this phenomenon than the Cloud Security Alliance. Started 4 years ago from scratch. It now has 15, 20, probably 25,000 members around the world, writing standards and rules for how we move information into the cloud. How do we secure it? How do the service providers enter into the contract commitments to protect the data? How can we trust it as evidence? Even this Cloud Security Alliance is working with the International Standards Organization, has published a guide on aligning the portfolio of rules that have been authored by the Cloud Security Alliance and its members with the ISO standard on the collection and forensic management of digital evidence. The game has already changed. We see these footprints of change, but is it possible to really tell us that we can integrate the law with technology, that we can actually set the rules in place so that we can automate trust the way that they're teaching in Australia? Two examples to share with you. Oh, I'm sorry, and one other thing. What we're seeing is just that. As the standards become more precise, the corporations are themselves automating the controls. Think of Willy Wonka. His father used to put the toothpaste top on the toothpaste, and he goes unemployed. He lost his job because of automation. And then he came back and got the job of repairing the machine that put the toothpaste top on the toothpaste tube. But what we're seeing is an evolution in how we deal with precision and execution. We're automating where we no longer need to rely on human discretion. In Great Britain, they now put RFID chips in wristbands that workers wear in the warehouses. They move a box from the pallet over here to the pallet. And when they do so, they're actually monitoring the behavior. Originally, they were concerned about workers taking too many smoking breaks or workers going over to see Sally in accounting rather than moving boxes from pallets. But then they realized they could track that. They realized they could measure it. They realized they could incentivize the workers to take shorter coffee breaks. Because if they moved 48 boxes per hour rather than 42, they would make more money. That's moving people. But what about information and rules? Well, I did some research and found that, in fact, in building architecture, they're doing just that. Singapore is a small nation. It's a dangerous place to live. They have earthquakes, they have tsunamis, they have typhoons. They care about building safety. Every building has to be submitted by design to the architectural authorities. And time and again, the Building and Construction Authority in Singapore was having problems because the designs were wrong. Or they try to cheat on the location of the fire escape, or they might put an insufficient amount of structural steel or the wrong grade of glass. How could we enforce all the legal rules about buildings in that situation? What they did was they took codes, tags, and actually said for every beam, every bolt, every window, every frame piece, every screw, every nail, we will assign an ISO code. And then we will associate the rules for safety to those items. So when the blueprint was drawn up by the architect and he was using steel beams that only supported 4,000 weight per foot and it required 6,000, the rule would pop up and indicate it was not being executed properly by the architecture. As a result, this Building and Construction Authority in Singapore was actually able to eliminate human review of blueprints. The blueprints were digitally submitted and electronically evaluated against thousands of building codes to demonstrate that they were, in fact, complying with the rules. The results have been phenomenal. Buildings have gone up faster, they've gone up at lower cost, greater profit, fewer risks, fewer typhoons, right? Bringing down buildings, fewer people die. Here's a set of screenshots from a software company that helped build storage buildings, big buildings where you store grain and industrial equipment. They did the same thing. See if we could take all the architectural design rules that apply to our building and treat it like a system. It's pretty simple. There's a building. It has a footprint. It has walls. It has a roof. It has frame. And let's begin to associate all of the rules that need to be satisfied with that design. Here we begin to see that process evolving, where for each rule, there actually has this little link over on the right. See that red line with little blue spots? If you click on that, it pulls up all the legal rules that apply to that element of the building. And they have different directories for different physical geographic jurisdictions. If the building's to go into Illinois, the rule set's already aligned. So it is indeed possible for us to align legal rules, technology rules, to things and systems. A building is nothing but a system that stores stuff. Why can't we do that with digital stuff? Why are we spending globally billions of dollars to try to figure out how to trust the digital information, how to even find it? We're doing it correctly in architecture. Why can't we do it in information architecture? So I'll take that strategy and make one amplification to it. Let's commit to a rules-based design model for building trust. Easy to say, but Jeffrey, you've criticized existing rules. What makes a good rule? That's one of the things that has been fun for me, intellectually, passionately, to abandon the rule of law and try to figure out how techies write rules. You know, last week I was thrilled because I was talking to one of the professors at Oxford who's in probability mathematics. And what he does is calculate the probabilities of an application doing the job it's supposed to do, firing all of the rules. And he had offered to take me out for a pint and we would talk, but as he began to read my work, he said, you know what, let's skip the pint. Would you do a whiteboard with me? And we began to sketch out what a three-dimensional envisioning of an information system would look like, just like those building architectures, where instead we're integrating legal rules to the way we calculate the systems. The rules have to be precise. We can no longer use reasonable, material, appropriate, adequate, satisfactory, sensitive. We have to use the precision that allows the technologist to write the code that aligns. It means we have to be atomic. We have to be precise. Just like we shine a white light through a crystal and see all of its component parts, we need to be able to break our rules down so that we can reassemble them so that information has the power coming the other way. Clear, focused, intense, and precise. Now, it is involved math up here. Every moment, every day, even as you listen to the speech, you're calculating how many more minutes to the drinks, or is it worth staying and listening 3 more minutes? That calculus is instantaneous, but that's what the mathematicians are trying to figure out. And as IBM announced last week, a chip that reaches 95% of the computational capability of the human brain, we're getting close. Imagine a chip that can do all of that calculus as fast as we can in evaluating whether to trust that email, whether to buy that object, or whether to have our systems rely on their data. It's what business is all about. It's about the obvious. And so the math is not easy. There's some great work by Cliff Neumann over on the West Coast about calculating distrust. But even if it's mathematically possible, even if it's computationally possible, I still haven't dealt with the fundamental big question. How do I make wealth? The business case has to be expressed differently. We no longer can talk about compliance and regulation and finding the evidence. We have to show that information governance is an affirmative exercise in creating wealth. Or for those organizations like government agencies that say they're not in the business of making money, preserving their wealth. But unless we can show that what we do and what we want to do connects to the business purpose, we'll never get there. See, there's a very simple way of explaining it. In every business relationship, there's a buyer and a seller. Money moves from here to there. But in every dollar of revenue that a business receives, euro, krona, pound, some set piece of money, that money, has to be set aside to underwrite the possibility of risk. Call it a risk reserve. You think of Basel II, the standards that govern banks. They're saying there's a certain amount of money you have to keep in the basement in case bad things happen so that you can take care of things and we don't have another big explosion. Every business runs the same way. Even the crepe stands in Paris. But on the consumer side, we've never focused on that side. That within every dollar that is spent is an inherent and discretionary trust discount. You know, when I buy a box of cereal, I'm trusting them to say there's no mouse droppings or mouse parts inside the sealed cardboard box. Or then they say it's filled with robust blueberries, and you open it up and you find a few really dried, shrunken ones at the bottom that have settled after 4 months on the shelf. It's a trust issue. And so I don't pay as much when I don't have confidence the product will do everything I need it to do. The same process when we're dealing with trusting information. And so within that trust discount, within the risk reserve, there's an economic balance. And if I can reduce the amount that the company has to keep in the bank for bad things happening, or increase the revenue by showing the consumer, my buyer, confidence in the product, there's more wealth. When that product is information, the game changes. The strategic value here to countries, economies that are not weighted down by what's happening in North America today is to not wait for 25 years of judicial ad hoc one-by-one decisions to try to carve out how do we handle digital information as evidence of the truth. Instead, build the rules faster within the technology with the precision and capability that allows us to automate the confidence we have in how things are done. Europe used that strategy when they built the directive on privacy and data protection. The the commissioner of the EU on data protection said in 2004, we designed our rules to create a competitive advantage against the United States that continued to do things industry by industry. The same opportunity is here. Look what India and China did. They skipped entire generations of copper-based telephony and went direct to mobile. In Eastern Europe, as e-discovery just begins to cascade in, the same opportunities exist to skip a generation. For Europe, for Asia, the same opportunities to change how the rules are being written, to write the rules for the technology to soar. In fact, if you do it right, you can go really fast. Now, I promised you 4 cornerstones, and I only gave you 3. That's because I didn't really want to talk to you about how I discovered the 4th one until the end. You see, Archimedes had his bathtub. He jumped out and yelled, "Eureka!" For me, it really was the shower. I was trying to figure all this out. It had been weeks and weeks back in 2011, and suddenly it came to me that I needed something else. There was one more thing that I had to figure out. And I did, in the shower, standing there, naked as a bird. I jumped out, opened the bathroom door, shouted down the stairs to my wife, "I figured it out, write this down!" And she loves me, and she yelled back out, not that I'm a loony, and she didn't call the people to take me away in a jacket. She said, "What is it? I'll write it down." And I called it the velocity principle. The velocity principle recognizes that everything we're talking about in making money, in creating trust, in building and designing, is better when we realize what we learned on the dilemma of dead man's curve. We have to enable velocity. If we don't do that, we fail. Time is money, money is time. Now, how much importance is there to velocity? I was fascinated in 2012 when the Securities and Exchange Commission fined the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange gets all the trade data. They're supposed to distribute it in a fair and reasonable manner to the entire market. But the SEC said you were not doing so. You were giving preferential advantage to your own customers and not to the entire market. How much time was being mattered? Why did the New York Stock Exchange get fined millions of dollars? The differentials between when the NYSE's customers and the rest of the market got the data was sometimes 50 milliseconds. I can't even think that fast. And yet that's enough time to allow preferential advantage for tens of millions of dollars in trades. Now, they're actually calculating in nanoseconds. And how does that happen in the marketplace of the securities exchanges and the brokers and traders? They all have built trust in the resilience and speed and velocity of their data. And so the velocity principle contradicts everything you know, I think, particularly for lawyers, as to the way we behave. And this is simple. This is what I screamed down the stairs, standing there, dripping wet, butt naked. The velocity of information is proportional to the transparency of governance. The more we know about how information has been designed, how it has been structured, created, managed, accessed, controlled, stored, and possibly even disposed of at the right time, the faster we can decide that it's what we need for business. The faster we can decide it satisfies the rule of law, the faster we can decide it is the evidence of the truth. Hide transparency. Don't tell me how you created it or what you did to store it. And the speed of information degrades. Every border of a system stops data until the rules have been demonstrated to be satisfied. Every country stops human beings at the border until we've satisfied the rules of entry. Look at how much difference there is now when they can scan the barcode on our passports. Imagine we take all the rules that govern information, including the legal rules, and we're able to compress it into a barcode that could be read in milliseconds or nanoseconds to verify that the data is accurate, it's factual, that it is indeed evidence of the truth. We're seeing that with XBRL, other reporting languages. It's happening globally. And the winners will be those that get it. The losers will be those that continue to believe they should not provide transparency into how information is governed. So I said to you a strategy. I said 4 cornerstones. And finally, a challenge. As you go through this conference and talk to the vendors and talk to the experts and listen to the other presentations, ask yourself just one simple question. Is their solution helping to create wealth and increase velocity? Or are they continuing to live in the 20th century and with their head stuck in the sand, hoping that change will not see them hiding? That's the world we're in. Trust is the new ROI. Is digital trust capable of being achieved? Well, as Carol did share with you, and not that I knew she was going to do it until this morning, I am alive and with you today because digital trust does work. On August 1st, as I lay in the gully having flown off my bicycle over a bridge and fell 7 meters at a velocity and impact of 32 miles an hour, I did not think I would live. But the EMTs found a band with an ID on it that was connected to a website. They were able to look me up, look at my health history, get my insurance data. By the time they hauled me into the squad, they had my heart rate, my cadence, my pulse. They knew that one lung was collapsed, and they knew that I was broken in half in my neck. They put me in the helicopter. They continued to monitor. And all that data was fine. I was conscious through this. And so I actually did have the thought, as we were in the helicopter, my God, I'm watching digital trust in action. The doors flew open on the trauma center. They knew who I was. They had 2.5 hours of medical history on me. They cut the clothes off my body. They took x-rays. They checked pulse points. They put me into a CT machine. They put me in an MRI machine. And then they rolled me into the surgical theater the next morning. And the doctor had seen system upon system connect, digital information upon digital information build until he had the full picture. He had all the truth. And he knew where to cut to save my life. I submit close before drinks with one thought. If we can make the investments in those systems so that information can be valued and trusted, literally to save lives every day. Notice there were no lawyers involved. There were technologists, there were doctors, and there were patients to save. The time's come for us to begin to build the rules to trust digital information as evidence of the truth, and to leverage the experiences we're having in these first years of the 21st century to build a new model. The economies, the innovators, the stakeholders who do so are going to be the ones who create new wealth and prosper in the digital world. Those that do not will not. And that's the opportunities for all of us as we move forward. My name is Jeffrey Ritter, and for the rest of my career, I'm preaching the gospel of digital trust. Thank you for your attention. Oh, she's not taking me off the stage.
No, I'm not taking it off. Jeffrey, as I knew you would, you've raised some really provocative thoughts for us this evening, and as we go forward on our Congress for the next couple of days. Before I open the proceedings to the audience for questions, I have a couple of my own. You mentioned that standard development is now occurring away from traditional Western legal venues, and those are the things that are really influencing the quality of digital information.
Yep.
Can you give us a few more examples of what you have in mind there?
Well, 2 that I mentioned were the British Standards Institute and the Cloud Security Alliance. But we're also seeing areas that are completely, almost surprising they're out there, and yet they're very practical. In Dublin, Ohio, there's something called OCLC, an acronym, but it actually is the database of where all the information about all the library contents of all the libraries of the world is maintained. And they've taken the lead in building the metadata structures so that we can index and find information on the web the same way that we find books on the shelf of a library. Monumental task, tens of thousands of libraries connecting, all about proving the authenticity of web-based data, finding it, and it's occurring quite independent of anything else that we hear. Yet if I'm building a web page today, I know about the Metacore initiative, the W Core initiative, and I'm aligning the defining data about my website to connect to that. In so doing, I'm creating a record of what might be the evidence in a later legal proceeding.
Are you talking now about creating a jurisdictional conflict, though? I mean, are you proposing that legislative bodies basically cede their authority to standards bodies?
That's, as they say, that's a good question. I actually would suggest that's not what I'm proposing. The public interest, to the extent there is a nation-state government in place to represent it, is benefited by the independent thought that is given to what the rules should be. But because this is so complex, what we're seeing is that nation-states are embracing standards as the expressions of the rules that must be satisfied. The Food and Drug Administration has adopted ISO standards to govern manufacturing quality. The Israeli Standards Authority certifies any product for export to comply with all standards that may apply to that, to improve the competitiveness and the safety of those exported products in the global market. So instead of seeing it as a conflict, I see it as a shift in where the rulemaking occurs, but still with the public interest in mind. I've said it this way, since I was working at the UN. Governments have the inherent power to regulate, but if the rules are properly authored, they will defer that power so that the market is benefited. That's what I think is happening next. We're going to see the nation states exist, but we're going to see them rely on the standards to define the information.
But don't those standards lack something that laws provide, that is to say the resources of enforcement? If we break a law, governments have the authority to seek fines and sanctions and perhaps even throwing us in jail. But if a trading partner doesn't comply with the standard, there seems to be no adverse consequences immediately available.
Well, first of all, I have to say that when the laws were changed in the United States that dealt with Sarbanes-Oxley and Graham-Lee-Filey and all that, one of the great things for those of us that practice law there was, the client's ultimate question was always, will I go to jail if I do not do what you tell me to do? And now we can actually say yes, and the answer ties to technology. But in fact, you put your finger on the same thing that Brian did. It's very hard for the nation states to enforce requirements against bad actors, though, that are outside their jurisdictions. So the systems, the networks, the owners of those have to figure out how to write the rules to be self-enforcing. When there's behavior that causes harm, it's usually an opportunity to write further rules and create the controls that protect against that behavior. Target learned that lesson the hard way in the United States. They thought they had a good system, but somebody sent an email to a heating contractor who thought he was being innocently asked to verify his password. And through that simple process of one-factor authentication being spoofed by the bad actors, they got in, and there's really no meaningful enforcement. They can never find the bad guys. So to rely upon rules in the systems, we have to count on our systems to also be self-enforcing. And I think that's where the challenge will be. Are we comfortable with the way machines enforce those rules versus relying upon more traditional venues such as the courts?
Our audience is certainly comprised of a number of practitioners, I would suspect. What next steps on that level would you recommend?
Well, first of all, I had the opportunity to be invited by Fred to send in some materials for my new book. You've been distributed one of the chapters on the velocity principle. Please, I would encourage them to read it. But then the second step is to go back and start having a dialogue inside the company. Do we understand how to build our own house? Do we know how to live in the house of our contractors? Do we have all of the rules that we need? And are we enforcing those rules properly? Those of us that have dealt with digital information as evidence often find time and again, as I mentioned earlier, We go inside the companies and find there is no enforcement. The simple truth of the 21st century is each of us are too busy. We have too many other duties as assigned that we can rely on people to always do the right thing. We have to write those rules into the systems, and those are the next steps that I would suggest. And make sure that they act on the challenge that I presented through the rest of the conference.
What sort of entities do you see emerging as repositories of trusted information, and how will they differ from the ones we've had traditionally?
Entities that, as depositories of trusted information. First thought that comes to my mind is the churches before the year 1000. As we first had printing, that was where truth was reposited, and the churches were the custodians of those records. Then libraries. And then, many people don't realize it, but it was really hard for small-time town lawyers to go to the library to get published books of cases. So where did Lexis begin? It was a simple task of somebody saying, what if we print these and make these available by dial-up modem and print them on thermofax paper? And they did. And the question is, how did lawyers come to trust this commercial third party? They had to create rules, and they had to gain confidence in those rules. Now we're seeing a plethora of opportunities out there, but the real challenge in who will be trusted is how we write the rules for ourselves on what that trust represents. It means pulling all of the rules together, in my case when talking about digital trust, but making sure that they're authentic and they can be proven so through transparency. The providers that do that best will be the archives that survive and prosper. The providers that cannot demonstrate that through transparency and effective governance will fall to the wayside.
We'll be happy to take any questions from the audience now.
There's a microphone there. There's one on your. Thank you.
You talked a lot about building trust, but you've also talked a lot about institutions that we should no longer trust. And I'm interested, how much do you see it as the need to build more trust? And how much do you see it as a need to reallocate our trust?
The institutions that already exist have an opportunity to build better trust. It means that they have to build better governance and demonstrate they're executing that governance. Those could be Girl Scout troops. They could be social clubs, towns, cities, nation states, corporations, federations of corporations. It doesn't really matter what the entity is, but the crisis in trust, I would submit, is authentic. And the beauty of the internet is its design. It was originally designed to route around failure. In the 21st century, for the rest of those people that have young careers, and for people like me that will look at it from the other side of our careers, we're going to be in a battle to determine what failure represents in terms of the availability and authenticity and integrity of information. Every day, companies are building new solutions that aren't trying to retrograde an existing structure. There was a report 2 weeks ago that just in 2014, just in the United States, $2.4 billion had been invested in new companies to manage health data more effectively. That wasn't the size of the market. That wasn't the technologies of revenues. That was the investment funds that were building the solutions. They've already demonstrated with the market, they've given up on any institutions to build trust into their data. They're scooping it out and building new institutions. I think it's a battle. And it's going to be a battle that is going to be, has to be driven from the consumer side in executing and discounting things when the trust does not exist. That's how the market will route around failure, and trust will favor those that achieve it. Hope that's responsive.
Another question?
I think it's time for drinks.
It's not quite time for drinks. First, I understand we're going to be treated to a short video.
Perfect.
But thank you, Jeffrey.
All right.
Everybody should join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.